step with me into the marsh. It is January, the year 878. Somerset in the west of England. The water here is black and cold, and it does not care who you are. Reeds close over your head as you push through, and the ground beneath your feet is not ground at all. It is a lie the marsh tells you, a crust of mud over deeper mud, and if you trust it fully it will swallow your boot to the knee. You are a king. Or you were 3 days ago, when you had a hall and a hearth and men who called you lord. Now you have almost nothing. A handful of loyal men. Whatever weapons you carried out the door. And behind you, somewhere in the dark, an enemy who came in the dead of winter, when no one makes war, and took your capital while you slept. Your name is Alfred. You are the King of Wessex, the last independent English kingdom on this island, the last piece of a country that has been falling, one region at a time, for 13 years. And right now, hiding in a swamp with wet feet and no crown on your head, you are as close as any king in English history has ever come to simply ceasing to exist. If Alfred dies here, in this cold, indifferent marsh, forgotten, unremarkable, England as an idea dies with him. He does not know that yet. He only knows that he is cold and hunted, and that somewhere out there a Viking army is drinking his wine. How does the most beaten king in English history become the only one they ever called the Great? Because that is what happened. Not immediately, not obviously, but from this exact moment, a fugitive with wet boots in a Somerset bog, Alfred of Wessex will claw his way back from total ruin, defeat the army that broke him, and build the systems that let the idea of England survive long enough to eventually become a real thing. And along the way, history will decide it needs a better story than he hid in a swamp and slowly rebuilt an army. It will need a folktale. A homely, human, faintly embarrassing little legend about a king, some bread, and a woman who had no idea who he was. You have probably heard it. The King and the Burnt Cakes. Almost none of it is true. And the real story, the actual sequence of catastrophe, patience and engineering that turned Alfred from a fugitive into a legend, is more interesting than the folktale that replaced it. This is that story. If you want the real history behind the legends, the evidence, not just the folklore, subscribe and walk with us. We separate the two carefully every time. To understand how bad January 878 really was, you have to understand what had already happened to England before Alfred was ever crowned. In the year 865, a coalition of Viking armies, what the English chroniclers came to call the Great Heathen Army, landed in East Anglia. This was not a raid. Raids came and went, burned a monastery, took some silver and left. This was different. This was an army that intended to conquer and stay. And it worked, kingdom by kingdom. Northumbria in the north fell first, its last king killed, its royal line effectively ended. East Anglia fell next, its king Edmund was killed and later remembered as a martyr. Mercia, the great Midland kingdom, was battered and reduced until its own king fled into exile and the Vikings installed a puppet in his place. By the early 870s, of the 4 ancient kingdoms of Anglo-Saxon England, 3 were gone or broken. Only one remained fully independent. Wessex, in the south and west. And in April of 871, in the middle of that same desperate war, a young man named Alfred became its king. He was perhaps 22 years old. He had already fought that year, 9 battles against the Danes in a matter of months, by one count with mixed results. He inherited not a peaceful kingdom to govern, but the last defensible position in a losing war. For years, Alfred held on. He bought time with treaties and, when the sources allow us to say so honestly, with silver, paying the Vikings to leave, the way desperate kingdoms across Europe had learned to do. It was not glorious. It was survival. And then came the winter that nearly ended everything. Wars by the custom of the age paused in winter. Armies did not campaign in January. Everyone understood this, which is exactly why it was so devastating when one side broke the rule. In January of 878, a Viking force under a leader named Guthrum made a sudden deliberate attack on the royal residence at Chippenham, in the depths of winter, when Alfred and his court had every reason to believe they were safe. It was in effect a decapitation strike, and it very nearly worked. The attack scattered Alfred's court and forced the king himself to flee, not with an army, not in good order, but as a fugitive with a small band of followers, into the wild, waterlogged country of the Somerset marshes. Some of his people submitted to the Danes outright. Others fled overseas. For a period of weeks, the King of Wessex was, in the most literal sense, hiding in a swamp, and the outcome of the entire war against the Vikings hung on whether he survived the winter. This is the exact moment and place, a rough camp on the low, marshy ground around a place called Athelney, where the most famous story about Alfred was later attached. You know the version. A weary, unrecognized king takes shelter in a peasant woman's cottage. She asks him to watch some cakes baking on the fire while she works. Lost in his own dark thoughts about the ruin of his kingdom, Alfred lets the cakes burn. The woman, not knowing she is scolding a king, gives him a sharp piece of her mind for his carelessness. It is a wonderful story. It has been told for children and painted on plates and printed in history books for well over 100 years. It is almost certainly not true. The earliest surviving version of this tale does not appear until roughly a century after Alfred's death, in a saint's life written about a different figure entirely, and it drifts into stories about Alfred only later still. No contemporary source, no chronicle written anywhere near his own lifetime, mentions burnt cakes, a cottage, or a scolding peasant woman. Historians who study this period are consistent on the point. It is a later legend, probably invented to illustrate something people wanted to believe about Alfred: his humility, his capacity to be humbled and to accept a rebuke without using his rank to escape it, rather than a record of anything that actually happened in that swamp. What we do know from sources closer to the actual events is colder and in some ways more remarkable than any burnt cake. We know that Alfred, at the absolute lowest point of his reign, hunted, diminished some of his own people already submitting to the enemy, did not surrender, did not flee overseas as some of his nobles had, and did not sue for terms. He waited, he gathered, and in the spring he struck back. Somewhere around Easter, word went out from the marshes of Athelney, quietly, carefully, to the men of the shires who had not yet given up. By early May, Alfred had done something that should not have been possible for a king recently reduced to hiding in a swamp. He had assembled an army. The chronicle sources describe forces gathering from Somerset, Wiltshire, and part of Hampshire, ordinary levies, the fighting men of 3 shires, rallying to a king many of them may have assumed was finished. He met them at a pre-arranged point, and from there he marched to confront Guthrum's army directly. The armies met near a place called Edington, in Wiltshire. The details of the tactical battle are not richly recorded. This is not a fight we can reconstruct move by move, the way you might describe a modern engagement. What the sources agree on is the outcome. Alfred's force met the Viking army and won a decisive victory. The Danes broke and fled the field. Alfred did not simply celebrate a battlefield win and let the enemy regroup. He pursued. He followed the defeated Vikings back to their fortified position at Chippenham and settled in for a siege, cutting them off, starving out the men who only weeks before had driven him from that very same place. After roughly 2 weeks under siege, Guthrum had no options left. He surrendered. And what followed the surrender is one of the strangest, most consequential scenes in early English history. As part of the peace, Guthrum agreed to be baptized as a Christian. 3 weeks later, the Viking king and 29 of his chief men underwent the rite at Alfred's own court, with Alfred himself standing as sponsor to his former enemy. Think about the audacity of that moment. A king who had been a fugitive in a swamp months earlier was now standing as godfather, in effect, to the leader of the army that broke him. It was not mercy for its own sake. It was strategy of the highest order, binding a dangerous enemy into a new relationship, using the deepest ritual of Alfred's own faith as the mechanism of peace. Victory did not mean Alfred could simply push the Vikings off the island. It meant he was now strong enough to negotiate a settlement from a position of power rather than desperation. In the agreement that followed, remembered as the Treaty of Alfred and Guthrum, the 2 men drew an actual line across England. It ran roughly along the Thames, up the River Lea, across to Bedford, and along the River Ouse. South and west of that line, Alfred's Wessex and the parts of Mercia still under English control. North and east of it, territory that would be governed under Danish custom and law, what history remembers as the Danelaw. This was not the England you would recognize on a modern map. It was formerly a divided island, an English kingdom and a Scandinavian ruled zone, existing side by side under a negotiated peace rather than a single crown. But a negotiated peace, backed by a real border and a defeated enemy, was worth more than anything Alfred had been able to buy with silver in the desperate years before. For the first time in over a decade, Wessex had something like a stable frontier. Alfred had no intention of letting the next winter attack catch him unprepared again. we're following the full engineering of how a broken kingdom rebuilt itself, not just the battle but the systems behind it. If you want the deeper breakdowns and the maps of what comes next, the membership link is in the description. Now back to the work of building a country that could not be surprised twice. Alfred had learned, in the worst possible way, what a surprise midwinter attack could do to a kingdom with no prepared defence. He spent the years after Edington making sure it could never happen again. What he built was a network of fortified strongholds across Wessex and the parts of Mercia allied to him. Places called burhs, a word that survives today buried inside ordinary English town names and inside the very word borough. These were not simple forts in the middle of nowhere. They were often existing towns and markets, deliberately strengthened with earthen ramparts and timber defences, with land parcelled out to settlers on the condition that those settlers would help man the walls when the horns sounded. The scale of the planning survives in a document historians call the Burgal Hiddage, an administrative record listing the burhs of Wessex, the length of their defensive walls, and the precise number of men required to hold each one, calculated down to a formula. This was not improvisation. This was a king turning the trauma of Chippenham into a system, and the system had a specific deliberate design. The burhs were spaced closely enough, roughly 30 kilometres apart in the densest areas, that nowhere in the kingdom was a community more than about a day's journey from a fortified place of refuge. If the Vikings struck again, ordinary people would not need to run for miles across open country, hoping to outrun raiders on horseback. They would run to the nearest burh, shut the gates and wait for the danger to pass or for Alfred's forces to respond. It worked. When Viking armies returned to English shores in the 890s, in a fresh wave of campaigning, they found a kingdom that could no longer be surprised the way it had been surprised at Chippenham. The burh network held. The renewed invasions failed to achieve anything like the near collapse of 878. Alfred had turned the worst night of his reign into a permanent lesson written in earth and timber across the length of his kingdom. Here is the part of Alfred's story that gets less attention than the battles and deserves more. In the years of relative peace after Edington, Alfred did something unusual for a warrior king of his era. He issued a law code, gathering his own judgments together with the laws of earlier English kings he respected, creating a single coherent body of law for his people to live under. And then he turned his attention to something even less expected: education. Alfred looked at the state of learning in his own kingdom and did not like what he saw. In his own words, preserved in a preface he had written for one of the books he commissioned, he lamented how completely learning had collapsed in England, how few priests, let alone ordinary people, could still read Latin well enough to understand the church services they performed and attended every week. His response was to personally sponsor, and by tradition partly translate himself, a program of putting key Latin texts into English, the language his people actually spoke and could actually read. Works of history, of philosophy, of pastoral guidance, rendered into the vernacular, so that knowledge did not remain locked behind a language most of his kingdom could no longer use. This is not the kind of thing that makes for a thrilling battle scene. But consider what it means. A king who had personally lived through the near-total collapse of his kingdom's military security did not conclude that walls and soldiers were the only things worth building. He concluded that a kingdom that could not read, that could not think, that could not pass on what it knew, was just as vulnerable as a kingdom with no army at all. We made something for people who understand that real strength includes the mind as much as the sword, the kind of history that doesn't need a burnt cake to be memorable. If you want to carry a piece of that, the link is in the description. Let's be precise about the title, because precision matters here. Alfred is, to this day, the only native-born English monarch who carries the epithet the Great. But that recognition was not something his own contemporaries handed him at his death. The title first appears in written sources centuries later, and it only became widely and popularly used from around the 16th century onward, long after Alfred himself, when later English writers looked back for a founding figure worthy of the name. And here is something that gets flattened in the popular telling. Alfred did not unify England. He could not have. In 886, after retaking London, he began styling himself King of the Anglo-Saxons, a real and significant claim reflecting leadership beyond Wessex alone, but still not kingship over a single unified England. When he died in 899, his son Edward the Elder inherited a strong, stable, expanding kingdom, not a unified one. That achievement, the first true king of the English, ruling the whole territory we would recognize as England, belonged to Alfred's own grandson Athelstan, who would not claim that title until 927, nearly 3 decades after Alfred's death. So Alfred did not create England. What he did was something more foundational than that, and in some ways harder to romanticize. He made sure there was still a Wessex, still an English royal line, still an English legal tradition, still English books being written in English, for his descendants to eventually build a unified kingdom upon. Without the man in the swamp who refused to disappear, there is no throne left standing for Athelstan to inherit and complete. Here is what stays with you. We remember Alfred for the burnt cakes because it is a comfortable story, a king humbled by an ordinary woman, made relatable, made human, made small enough to fit on a children's book page. It is a good story. It is simply not what happened. What actually happened is colder, slower, and in its own way far more impressive than any kitchen mishap. A young king inherited a war he was likely to lose. He lost almost everything, his capital, his court, nearly his kingdom, in a single midwinter night. He did not have a moment of clever improvisation that saved him. He had months of cold, uncertain waiting in a swamp, not knowing whether anyone would still answer his call when he finally sent for them. They did answer, and what he built afterward, the treaty, the burhs, the laws, the books, was not the work of a folk hero. It was the work of a survivor who had learned, in the most brutal way possible, exactly how fragile everything he cared about actually was, and who spent the rest of his life building systems, sturdy enough that it could never be taken from him again in a single night. That is a harder kind of greatness to paint on a plate. It does not have a punchline. It has a swamp, a long silence, and a king who simply refused, for months, to stop being king until enough of his kingdom believed it too and came when he called. Alfred saved Wessex. He did not live to see England itself become one kingdom. That work belonged to his grandson, a young, ruthless, brilliant king named Athelstan, who would finish what his grandfather started and become the first man ever to rule the whole of England. That story is next. Click it and walk with us.